Welcome to day 10 of 30 Days Through the New Testament. We're 1/3 of the way through, and we're finishing up the Gospel of Luke today. I'm recording this on the Wednesday before Easter, so if you're watching it at a later date, we're kind of getting ourselves ready for the day of Easter when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And today we'll be looking a lot at what led up to the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus in Luke's Gospel. We'll spend a lot of time on the resurrection when we get to John's Gospel, which should line us up right toward Easter for those of you who are watching it on the days that it's published. So a few things we want to look at before we get to the trial of Jesus, and Luke gives us quite a bit of detail into what happens. And so I want to set it up and tell you that there's a lot of this that's going to turn into sort of like a courtroom scene. You're going to start seeing where the religious leaders and the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're all trying to find a way to have Jesus killed. But they don't know how to do it. They don't want to do it themselves. They fear the crowds who love Jesus and what they might do if they were to do something to him. So they're really going to try and concoct a way to get the Romans to do it. They want the Roman government to kill Jesus off, but the problem they have is a lot of the arguments they have against Jesus are just Jewish laws. And the Romans don't care about the Jewish law. They don't care at all. They're like, hey, if you Jews have your own little religious laws, deal with it yourself, deal with your own time. As long as Jesus wasn't doing anything against Rome, against the Roman Empire, they really weren't very concerned. So we're going to look at some of the players in the whole story today with people like Pilate, who we know about. Also, you have Herod, which was Herod Antipas. It was a different Herod than the one we see at the birth of Jesus, who was trying to kill Jesus then and kill the babies. And actually, when we get to most of the gospel, at the beginning there, at Jesus' birth, that was Herod the Great. This Herod was called Herod Antipas, and he was the son of Herod the Great. And so when you see most of the gospels talking about Herod, it's Herod Antipas, the one we'll look at today. And so what's going on here, let me kind of give you a little backstory about what's happening in this time that'll help you understand what leads up to this. If you look with the charges being brought against Jesus, they try first of all to say, well, he's causing an insurrection, and he's causing an insurrection against Rome, which he wasn't. They really didn't have any justification for that he was going to try and overthrow Rome. I mean, he talked about doing an upheaval within the Jewish religious system, definitely, but nothing against the Roman Empire. They also tried to accuse him of not paying taxes, which we had seen just right before this. He had said, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God," when he was pressed to try and defend, who should you give money to? Is to Caesar or to God? And he advocated paying taxes to Caesar. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. So they keep trying to come up with all these different scenarios. And so the Sadducees even get to a point where they're going to try to trick him from an intellectual standpoint. Now, let me kind of hope this will make sense. The Sadducees were a small number of people, but they held a lot of power. They had money. They were looked as the intellectual elite, the elite, societal elite among the Jews. They were kind of snobby, for sure. They held to a certain position in Judaism that they only believed the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch, which was written by Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the only part they gave any credence to and said this is all that matters. They said the rest of the Old Testament only pointed back to those first 5 books. Otherwise, they didn't have any meaning. So there were instances in the book of Job where Job actually talked about the concept of resurrection. There's other places in the Old Testament that talks about resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection. They said it's not true. You live only for this life, and then you die, and that's it. And they say because resurrection was not found in the first 5 books of the Bible, then there is no resurrection. And so they lived for today, and they also were in really tight with the Romans. They tried to keep the Romans happy, just so they could keep their power, keep their influence, keep their money, all those things. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they butted heads a little bit with the Sadducees, and they followed not only what the Pentateuch said, but they had added so much to their religion, and they believed the entire Old Testament. They believed in resurrection. They taught that. So there was a big discrepancy of what they believed and how they looked at Judaism as a whole. So you come in here and they first start trying to stir up people to say, well, Jesus doesn't believe in paying taxes, or he's trying to overthrow Rome. And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God. So he kind of debunks that whole theory. And then the Sadducees come in Luke chapter 20, beginning verse 27, and they start trying to question Jesus about, well, let's get a scenario that he won't be able to figure out. Even though they didn't believe in resurrection, they go, well, we'll get him here. And so he starts talking about, Moses wrote that if a brother dies, his brother is supposed to take his wife, if he had no children, take his wife as his own and the children. So he says, but what's going to happen if this happens a third time and eventually happens 7 times, where the woman keeps being married to these brothers and they all die? Whose wife will she be at the resurrection? So they don't even believe in the resurrection, and they're going back to what Moses would have said, which would have been the first 5 books of the Bible, and they think they got Jesus trapped here. They thought Jesus is not going to be able to possibly condone the resurrection based on the first 5 books of the Bible, because they said it's just not there. It doesn't talk about resurrection. But Jesus throws them a curveball, and he actually shows that there is a proof of resurrection in the Old Testament and in the first 5 books of the Bible, and that this life is not the end of everything. So what he does is he starts talking about, and I want to clarify something here, because people have gotten a very, very wrong way of thinking about the Bible theologically and doctrinally. In verse 34, Jesus said, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in that age in the resurrection of the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So he's saying, look, when we're in heaven, we won't marry anybody and we won't be given in marriage. In fact, there won't be any need for marriage and procreation, because we'll never die. So there'll be no need to procreate children. It won't be there. And plus it says that relationship will end because Jesus will be the groom and we are his bride. Now, people ask the question a lot, well, will I know my spouse in heaven? Absolutely. Like, I believe, no doubt, I will know Shelley, and I will know that she was my wife, and she will know that I was her husband. There's no doubt about that. I think we will obviously know each other. We'll know our life together and everything else. However, our marriage will not be there, because our relationship with Jesus will be preeminent. That will be the biggest relationship. And Shelley and I will have another relationship, that we were brothers and sisters in Christ, because everything will be pointed to Jesus. So he says in there, people won't be married or given in marriage. And it says, and they will no longer die. And look what he says, for they are like the angels. This little verse, and there's a couple others, people get so messed up. They go, oh, so we'll be like the angels. And I've heard people say, when people die, they go, oh, well, they finally got their angel wings, or heaven got another angel. Let me tell you something. When you die, when your loved ones die, we don't become angels, period. So if someone dies, please don't say, oh, heaven got another angel. No. We will actually be above the angels. We will be the redeemed that Jesus died for. Jesus didn't die for an angel. Angels don't get saved. Angels are eternal, who've lived, they were created by God, and they're eternal for the rest of eternity like we will be, but they're different. They are not redeemed by God. What it's talking about here when it says we will be like the angels, you got to look at the verse 4. It says we will no longer die. We will be like the angels. So we're going to live forever, like the angels will be eternal around the throne of God. So please don't misinterpret that and say, oh, we're going to be like angels when we die. We're going to get our angel wings. I don't want to be like an angel. I want to be like me. And I want to be a perfect version of me that God has saved and changed. So there you go. But he says here, the next verse, verse 37, he says, but in the account of the bush, the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. Now, what he says is, this is this is where you got to really know what's being said here in the original language. And and hear what's being said. When he says that, when it says in verse 37, Moses showed the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham. Now this is like saying he is the God of Abraham, he is the God of Isaac, and he is the God of Jacob. Not he was the God of Abraham when he was alive, he was the God of Jacob when Jacob was alive, and he was the God of Isaac when he was alive. He didn't say he was the God of them when they lived. He said he is now the God to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. That can only happen if they are still existing. And so they are existing. They're existing in heaven. And he says in there, he is not the God of the living. He's not the God of the dead, but the living. For to him all are alive. So it says in there, in the next verse, it says, some of the teachers of the law, who are not Sadducees, they go, well said, teacher. And they said that because they were sticking it to the Sadducees, like, ha, you guys are wrong and we are right. There is a resurrection. And he just pointed out. They weren't happy about Jesus, but they were happy to see him stick it to the Pharisees, to the Sadducees. So I hope that made sense. I hope that's a kind of a tough passage to look at and everything. But he keeps going on. He gets down to chapter 21. And he talks about signs of the end of the age. We talked a lot about that, and we looked at Matthew chapter 24, so I won't kind of go. It's a very similar account of what will happen in the end of the age. But then he gets to chapter 22, and we get to the betrayal of Judas, when Judas goes out. If you want to hear about betrayal, I actually preached. This was the last sermon I preached before the quarantine came in with the coronavirus. I preached about how to handle betrayal and talked a lot about what Judas's role was here and some of the attitudes there. So if it's something you've dealt with, I would encourage you to go on our website and listen to that sermon. So since I just preached on it, I'm going to kind of skip through a little bit of that. I do want to get something before the trial of Jesus, and that is when we get to chapter 22 and verse 31. This is right after there was another disagreement. We've talked about this before, where they start going, who's going to be the greatest? Who will be the greatest in the kingdom? They all want to be the greatest, and it's a bunch of selfishness. And Jesus says the one who serves is the greatest. But then he says in verse 31, he looks at Peter. And if you remember, Peter's real name was Simon. That's what he was called, was Simon. But Jesus changed his name, gave him a nickname, Peter, which meant rock. And sometimes Jesus would call him Simon. And when he did that, he was talking and saying, Peter, you're acting like your old self. You're acting like the old you. But when he called him Peter, he was saying, Peter, you're a rock. Now you're acting like the rock you should be. And I believe in you. I see what God can do in you, Peter. So he would change back and forth between Simon and Peter. He does it both of them in this passage, but I want you to see what he says to him. He said, Simon, Simon. And he didn't say Peter, Peter. He said Simon, Simon, kind of reiterating where he was. And he just got through talking about where they were arguing about who'd be the greatest. And he said, that's not what you're supposed to argue about. But he said, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. Now the you here, it says Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. The you is plural. So he's talking about Satan's going to sift you disciples. You are fixing to be shaken. And when he says to sift you as wheat, what they would do is they get wheat and try to separate it from the chaff. And they would get in a pan and they'd shake it violently. And they'd throw it up in the air, and the wind would catch the chaff and blow it away. But they would shake it real good to get it stirred up and throw it up in the air. It was a kind of, it wasn't, I wouldn't say violent, but it was a lot of aggression to get it like that. And he's trying to tell Peter, he said, you disciples are fixing to be shaken violently. And that's going to happen in his crucifixion. When they're terrified, they're running in fear, all these things are about to happen. Their life is fixed to be turned upside down. And he says, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. Satan asked to shake you. Imagine that Satan asked for permission to do this. And God obviously said, okay, do it. But look what it says. But I had prayed for you, Simon. So he says, Peter, Satan's asked to sift all of you. You're going to be shaken. But I prayed for you, Peter. Not plural, you singular. Peter, I prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, because he's telling Peter, you're going to turn away. You're going to turn away from me. But when you turn back, he said, strengthen the brethren. Strengthen your brothers in Christ. Be the rock. And notice he says, I prayed for you, Simon, your faith will not fail. And So he wants him to know that there's something coming, a shaking, Peter. You're going to be rocked into your world. But I've prayed for you, Peter, and God is going to use you to strengthen you. And sometimes when we get shaken in our world, when life is going tough, sometimes we're being sifted, we're being shaken. Now, sometimes it's our own stupidity. We just do things that we bring it on ourselves. There's other times that you're like me, you've had things happen and you go, where did this come from? And why is this happening to me? Why am I having to go through this? And a lot of times it's God taking us through those trials, those difficult times, so that we come out on the other end strengthened. And just like Jesus said, I'm praying for you, Peter, we know that he has a purpose for us. It is hard and it's amazing. I go through these trials and I see God use it in my life, but the next time a trial comes, I seem to forget that God always uses it for good, and I worry and I fret and all these things. And we forget God is going to bring me through this. I will stay faithful to him. I will trust in him and know that he has a plan for me. And Jesus is trying to reaffirm that. So it's one of the characteristics of God that we see that he's going to do that. And let's get to the trial of Jesus and talk about this. And there's a lot of these that you can look. If you want to kind of put all of it together, you can kind of go back and forth with John 18 and 19, and you can get a full picture of exactly what happened in the trial. But Luke gives us quite a bit of information. It says that he comes and gets arrested, and what's interesting is that let me see. Hang on a second. I want to make sure I didn't miss something. Yeah, okay. I did want to go back and say this. Right after that, when Jesus tells Peter, after I told you about Simon Satan's asked to sift you. Right after that, Peter tells Jesus, he said, I'm ready to go to prison and to death for you. I'm not going to be sifted. I'm not going to turn back. And Jesus said, yeah, actually, before the rooster crows 2 times, you'll deny me 3 times. So he then tells the disciples something. He says, when I sent you a while back, and if you may remember when we read that he sent them out and told them to take nothing, but rely on God, depend on God. You'll go places, and God is going to supernaturally provide a place for you to stay with people. They'll provide food for you. They'll take care of you, and you're going to learn that God can be trusted because you're going to be well received. People are going to love you. You're going to be healing people and casting out demons and all this great stuff. And we read about this earlier in Jesus' ministry. And the disciples were like, yeah, we remember that. And Jesus tells them, it says, look, I did tell you one time, and y'all remember when I said don't take anything with you because you won't lack anything? And he said, yeah, we remember that. He said, but now I want to tell you this, things are going to be different. If you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, he will be numbered with the transgressors, and I will tell you that what must be fulfilled in me. And he says, in other words, he's saying, guys, last time I told you just to go and God will provide. Not this time. He said, this time you're going to have to take yourself. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be ridiculed. You're going to be out of a lot of things. You're going to struggle. This is going to be different, which is what we saw in all these disciples. They all go to a martyrdom death except for John, who died of natural causes. But the rest were all killed for their faith. They were treated horribly. They were in prison. They were persecuted terribly. He says, get ready because this is coming. And so we look at that and see how that played out over through the book of Acts. But anyway, didn't mean to divert too much. Let's go back to the arrest of Jesus. They come, they get Jesus. And when they do, Peter, I love this story, Peter, who's a fisherman, they try to come arrest Jesus, and Peter gets all upset and gets angry, reaches out and grabs the sword of one of the soldiers and cuts off a guy's ear. And Peter's trying to be all big tough guy, and I don't know what he thought he was going to do, like he was going to take on all these guys. But they get arrested, they take him up, and they begin to take him before Pilate. Now, let me kind of give you a word about Pilate, and so you'll understand. Pilate was the governor of this area, and Pilate had a little history behind him where he had done some really dumb things. There were 3 major instances, and I won't bore you with the details. You can look it up or ask me if you want to know. But Pilate did 3 different things that caused some problems among the Jewish people, where they were starting to rise up and rebel, causing a lot of friction between the Jews and the Romans. And it was because of Pilate did some stupid things. He just made some dumb mistakes, and most of it was out of his arrogance. Some was out of his anger. But all that to say, the Roman Empire was not happy with Pilate at all, because what they wanted Pilate to do was keep the peace. They said, that's really all we want you to do is keep the peace. Okay? Don't get the Jews all stirred up. We don't need a rebellion. We don't want to send our armies down there and fight against them. Keep the peace. And he just kept doing stuff to stir up the problems. And so he was kind of on his last leg with the Roman Empire, and he knew it. And so what had happened is, because of what was going on at the time and all that was happening, he had come down from where he normally lived and was in Jerusalem at this time. And also, the guy I told you, Herod, who was actually in charge of the Galilee region where Jesus was from, he was up in the Galilee region, and he and Pilate, they both had their authority in their own areas, but both of them happened to be in Jerusalem at this time. So the Jews come to Pilate, and they say, because he was the governor of their area, and they say, you got to get rid of this Jesus guy. He's just causing trouble, and he's causing problems. So Pilate goes, I don't want to fool with this. So he brings Jesus in, and he asks him some questions, and he tells him, this guy hasn't done anything. Everything you are complaining about, this is your own little religious rules. I really don't have time for this. He's not bothering Rome. I don't see anything wrong with him. Y'all handle it. And well, they kept pitching a fit and pitching a fit and pitching a fit. So he's talking to Jesus, and he says, where are you from anyway? And Jesus said, he tells me he's from Galilee. And he goes, oh, you're from Galilee. Well, you're Herod's problem. I mean, I don't have jurisdiction over there. That's Herod's area. So I'll send you to Herod, who, by the way, just happens to be in Jerusalem for what all's going on. He's just right over across the street. Go see Herod. So he sends him over to Herod. And Herod's all fired up to see him, because Herod knows about him. We know from other passages in the Bible that Herod knew who he was, and he didn't really like him. But he also knew the stories of him healing people and doing all kinds of miracles. And it said Herod wanted to see one of those. Herod thought, this would be cool. I can finally get this guy in here and make him do one of his tricks, is what Herod thought. He probably didn't think they were real, and he said, do it. I'll get him to come do a miracle. So he brings Jesus in, starts trying to get him to do this, and Jesus is like, no, he wouldn't do it. Jesus just kind of sat there, and he wouldn't do a miracle. He wouldn't do anything cool. So Herod just starts mocking him, and they dress him up and make him look like a king, and it's just a big joke to them, and go, send him back to Pilate. So they send him back to Pilate after they got through mocking him and all this stuff. So Pilate finally gets him back, and he's still going, this guy hasn't done anything. Well, the Jews start really getting angry, and he's like, man, if these people start rioting, I'm going to be in so much trouble with the emperor. I mean, I'm going to be I'll probably lose my job. I'll lose everything I have. I'll have a lot of influence. I'll lose all that, and I don't want to lose that. So he goes, well, I know these people like Jesus. He knew there were a lot of people that liked him. He knew there were a lot of that hated him, but he also knew he had a big following. So he thought, I know what I'll do. Every year at the Passover, as a kind of a peace offering to the Jews, Pilate would release a prisoner to them. And so he thought, hey, these people like Jesus so much, I'll give them the option to just take him off my hands, and they can do whatever they want with him. But it's just, I'll wipe my hands clean. He's their problem. And he probably thought that's what they would choose. So he comes out, and and it's really great because he gives Barabbas, and Barabbas is a murderer. He's an insurrectionist. He's a rebel. I mean, he's the kind you think, you don't want this guy back out on the streets. And they thought, well, if they have to choose between Jesus and Barabbas, I mean, sure, they're going to choose Jesus. He's not anywhere near as bad as Barabbas. So he brings him out, and he goes, I'm going to release one of these two guys. Who do you want? And they start yelling, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And he's like, are you kidding me? Barabbas is a dirtbag. He's dangerous. But they keep yelling, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And so he goes, all right, that's the deal. I'll give you who you want, and that's who you're going to get. And then he makes a mistake. He could have just said, all right, I'll give you Barabbas, and we'll put Jesus in jail. It seems like it would have been smart to put Jesus in jail and let the tension die down. Jesus would have been safe there. A lot of the crowd probably would have been happy because in their eyes, punishment was against Jesus. So it seems like the logical thing for Pilate to do, the smart thing to do, would just be, well, I'll just arrest Jesus and we'll let this die down. But like I said, Pilate was notorious for making dumb decisions. He always seemed to make the worst decision. that would stir everything up and get everything all messed up even more. And exactly what he does this time, he asks the crowd, well, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And they start yelling, crucify him, crucify him. And I'll tell you a thing, I think this is really funny. Maybe you'll think it's funny too. But we had a guy I worked with here at our church, Mike Skipper. And Mike used to tell me this thing I thought was really funny. He goes, you know, Ben, there's only 2 times you see people voting in the Bible. He said one time was in the Old Testament. They said, let us go back to Egypt in slavery. When they told Moses, hey, let us go back to Egypt. And the other time was when they voted and said, give us Barabbas. So he goes, that shows you people usually don't make good choices when they vote. And I thought that in voting the church, I thought that was pretty funny. But anyway, so they said, well, what am I going to do with Jesus? And I'm like, why did you ask them their opinion? They're all mad. They're all hot. They go, crucify him. Now notice they're not saying, let us crucify him. They finally have a chance to get the Romans to do it. And they say, because Pilate said, what shall I do with Jesus? You crucify him. He's like, oh, man, I told them, I asked them what they want to do. And if I don't do it, they're going to cause a fit. So he says, fine, but let his blood be on you. And they're like, fine, but you just do the killing. And so this is what leads to this whole thing. The whole thing was a complete sham of a trial. There was no evidence to prove that Jesus did anything he was accused of that would have warranted a Roman intervention for sure. Everything was sped through during the night, and there was no fair trial, nothing. Yet you go, why would this happen? How did this spin out of control so fast that just days before he was coming into Jerusalem, people yelling, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They're rejoicing, they're celebrating. How did things deteriorate so quickly? But when you look at it, there were so many things in place that God had. Even the small things like Pilate, of all people, were in charge there, and he had gotten himself in hot water. He was in the perfect storm to have made a horrible decision that would have favored the Jews. Herod just happened to be in Jerusalem at this time and be a player in this whole saga. All these things were working together in perfect timing for Jesus to be taken and rushed through and crucified, even though by all measures he had no reason whatsoever to be crucified. But he was like a lamb. The prophecy, remember it said, he was like a lamb who was led to the slaughter, and before his shearers he was silent. He didn't open his mouth, he didn't defend himself, and he was helpless from our standpoint in this sham trial. But all the time, Jesus knew what he was doing. And here's the beauty of it that we forget, and sometimes we don't think about it. I believe that when Jesus was standing before Pilate and before Herod, when he had the crowds yelling and mocking him and hating him, eventually at this point they're going to put a cross on him, make him carry a cross all the way to Golgotha where he'll be crucified. He knows what's going on. He sees what's going on. Jesus had seen crucifixions in that time. Everybody would have seen crucifixions. He knew the pain he was about to go through, but he also knew the spiritual implications of what was about to happen. And through all this, a man who was not guilty of anything, but also a man who was fully God, had the power to end this at any moment if he'd wanted to. But while he was doing that, Jesus, and again, we'll get to heaven and you can prove me if I'm right or wrong, but I think when Jesus did that, he knew that you and I and everybody, we were on his heart. He was doing this for one reason. He loves us. He loves us. And he wanted so badly for one thing to happen. He wanted sin to be punished so that we could be forgiven of our sin and be with him. And every time he was beaten and flogged and mocked and humiliated and falsely accused, the whole time he could have said, I'm not doing this anymore. But he did it out of love, saying, I want you to be with me one day in heaven. You and I, who weren't even born yet, we were a couple thousand years away from being born. but he was dying for us. He was being humiliated for us so that we could be made right with God. That's amazing what he did and what he went through for us and all that he did. Because I'm telling you right now, I don't think if I had the power to stop a crucifixion of me, I probably would have stopped it. If I had the power to stop the flogging of me, I probably would have stopped it. I know me well enough to know that when they started mocking me and making fun of me and putting a robe on me and ha ha ha, he's the king of the Jews, and just humiliating me in public, that'd have been enough for me to go, nah, I'm stopping all this. Y'all are fixing to see, oh, Herod, you want to see a miracle? Let me show you a miracle. I'm fixing to do something to you and your buddies here that's going to show you how powerful I am. But Jesus didn't. He let it all play out because he loved us. And that's an amazing thing he did, that when we see all of that, it makes us love him more. It makes us want to honor him more with our life. And it makes us see the agony he went through on our behalf. So I hope that's something that will make you spend time today thanking Jesus for what he did, thanking him for going through all that for me and all that for you. It's the greatest act of love that there has ever been in history. And that and the love God had in allowing his son to come down and do that for us. So tomorrow, we're going to start into the Gospel of John, and we'll see how John looks at a lot of things differently. There's a completely different attitude of how John, a mood of the book of John, and how John looks at it. And John was a very, very, very close friend of Jesus and loved Jesus dearly. He was so close to Jesus that when Jesus was on the cross, he looked at John and said, you take care of my mother. Of all the people he could have chosen, he said, John, I want you to take care of my mom. That's how close he was to John. So we're going to see John, who loved Jesus dearly, and we're going to see how he lays out the life of Jesus. So we'll do that tomorrow. I hope you're staying on your reading and staying faithful to it. And I'll see you tomorrow for day 11.